England is one of the four nations that make up the modern United Kingdom, alongside Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, being by far the largest in terms of land mass and population. England has for centuries been the most powerful and developed nation within the British Isles, having exerted its influence over its immediate neighbors through economic and military might. However, it may come as a surprise to know that for much of its early history, England itself was influenced by many other neighboring cultures and languages, from as far back as prehistoric times. England has played host to successive waves of migration and conquest, which over the subsequent millennia and centuries have coalesced into a unique mixture of language, culture, and heritage that is unlike anywhere else in the world. But how did this relatively small nation go on to mold not only the future destiny of the British Isles, but also shape much of the modern world in which we live today? This is the history of England. The nation of England has been shaped by countless political upheavals, wars, and invasions over the past several centuries, with perhaps the most iconic and defining of these being World War II. We all know that the Allies were ultimately victorious. However, if you've ever wondered how this conflict could have played out differently, you can now envision this for yourself by playing Call of War, who have kindly sponsored this video. You can fight up to 100 other players in this free-to-play online real-time PvP strategy game that can take weeks to fully complete, which is great if you're a fan of long-term strategic-based games like we are. You can recruit many different units to build out your army, including tanks, planes, and the nuclear bomb, as well as forge alliances with other players as part of your chosen grand strategy. Call of War can be played on both PC and mobile with the same account, and if you sign up with the link in the video description, you'll receive an exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and 1-month premium subscription for free. This offer is only available for 30 days after this video goes live, so don't miss out. The land that would one day become the nation of England looked very different to the first humans who settled there during the prehistoric Stone Age. Back then, the wider British Isles weren't even islands at all, but were instead connected to continental Europe by a land bridge. As the last glacial period came to an end around 11,000 years ago, the melting ice sheets caused the sea levels to rise, which subsequently flooded the low-lying land called Doggerland, thereby permanently cutting Britain off from Europe. Despite being separated from the continental mainland, communication and cultural exchanges continued to occur between the peoples of Europe and those inhabiting what would eventually become England. The practice of farming, which originated in the Middle East, was introduced around 4000 BC, and the first permanent settlements which possessed monumental tombs and ceremonial stone circles, such as Stonehenge, were also built around this time. As the Stone Age turned into the Bronze Age, England, for the most part, remained alike to the rest of Britain, and indeed the rest of Europe. Similar cultural and linguistic practices were introduced as a result of successive waves of migration from the continent, which eventually morphed into the Celtic culture, which had become widespread over much of Western Europe by the 12th century BC. Life for the Celtic peoples of England continued in much the same way for the next several centuries. That was until the year 55 BC, when an invasion force unlike any seen before landed on the southern coast. The Roman Republic, which would soon become the Roman Empire, was the uncontested superpower of the ancient world, having expanded across the Mediterranean as well as more recently further northwards into what is now modern France. The Roman general who had led the recent conquest of what was then termed Gaul was none other than Julius Caesar, whose ambitions soon turned to conquering the lands across the English Channel. Caesar's initial invasion achieved little more than landing his army on the coast, and so a second, larger-scale invasion followed the next year in 54 BC. This invasion saw Roman legions advance as far as the northern bank of the River Thames. Despite this relative success, the Romans could not establish a permanent foothold on the island during this time, and so withdrew back across the Channel. The Romans nevertheless remained convinced that the island could and should be conquered, and so almost a century later, the Roman Emperor Claudius ordered that a properly planned and maintained invasion attempt be carried out in the year 43 AD. Over the following decades, Rome's legions advanced across the land and brought almost all of what is now England under Roman rule, founding many settlements like London, Chester, and York in the process. Although Rome's authority was occasionally challenged by local revolts, such as the one led by Queen Boudica in 60 AD, England remained an integral part of the Roman Empire for the next several centuries, and had its northernmost border fixed in place with the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Like all empires in history, however, Rome's rise and fall was inevitable, and by the beginning of the 5th century, its power and influence had been significantly reduced. The last Roman legions were withdrawn from England in the year 407 to defend the more valuable parts of the empire on the continent, which were being threatened by numerous migrating barbarian tribes. A handful of these tribes soon turned their attention towards England, which set in motion a series of events that would establish and ultimately shape the very language, culture, and history of the English people. These Germanic tribes, collectively referred to in history as the Anglo-Saxons, first migrated to England sometime during the 4th century, probably serving as mercenaries in the Roman army. However, by the mid-5th century, a significant number of these peoples had settled in the eastern portion of the country. The precise nature of this process is still a matter of debate amongst historians, with some advocating for a large-scale invasion and violent displacement of the native Celtic population, while others argue for a more peaceful and gradual process of acculturation. In either case, the Anglo-Saxons replaced the Romano-British language, culture, and people with their own Germanic customs and ways of life. The language that they introduced would one day evolve into the English language that we speak today. Although the Anglo-Saxons were united in tongue, culture, and religion, they were politically separate, having established their own independent kingdoms across the land. By the 7th century, the native Britons had withdrawn themselves to the far western parts of the island, such as Wales and Cornwall, leaving the 7 Anglo-Saxon petty kingdoms of East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex to form the basis of a distinct but as yet disunited English nation. Over time, the Anglo-Saxons converted from their old Germanic pagan beliefs to Christianity, and set about consolidating power for themselves, often by fighting one another as well as the neighboring British kingdoms to the west and Picts to the north. By the late 8th century, however, the feuding Anglo-Saxons had amalgamated into 4 larger kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. However, the very survival of Anglo-Saxon England would soon be called into question when fleets of longboats began to appear off the coastline in the late 8th century. The Viking Age in England is widely attested to have begun with the well-documented raid on the Northumbrian monastery of Lindisfarne in the year 793. Although other smaller raids had been carried out in England before this time as well, and in other parts of the British Isles. What began as sporadic attacks on isolated treasure-laden monasteries continued well into the following century. But in the year 865, however, the Vikings adopted a change in strategy from hit-and-run raiding to one of conquest and occupation. Late that year, a vast Viking army landed in southeast England with the intention of taking the land of the four Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This great heathen army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle referred to the Viking force, first marched northwards and took control of the kingdom of Northumbria in 867, followed by East Anglia in 869, and then Mercia in 874, leaving only the kingdom of Wessex as the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Led by King Alfred, Wessex had thus far evaded the marauding Vikings, either by fighting them in battle or paying them off. However, by 878, the Vikings had overrun the greater parts of Wessex and forced Alfred into hiding, with the threat to his kingdom and the future of England hanging in the balance. King Alfred was able to muster an army for a last stand against the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in May of that year. Ultimately proving victorious, King Alfred